The next section deals with avoiding sin. And as I've already mentioned, avoiding sin is a key component to tazkiyah. Or let me take a step back. The key component to tazkiyah is maintaining purity of the heart. So the heart is what we're going to grow, and we need to weed out all of the sin and keep it pure. So sin, like I've said a couple times before, is the key battle. The first step towards developing spiritually is to avoid sin. This is the number one thing. If I'm working with someone, this is the first thing we work on. A basic routine, and the next thing is, let's get rid of these sins. How do you avoid sin? We avoid sin by appreciating what is a sin, which means we need to understand from the deen what is a sin and what is not, and that's very important, and I don't want to just gloss over this, because in this day and age, we let our minds go wild, and the way that society is organized, who knows even what's right and wrong anymore. It's a blessing upon us that the deen makes what's good and bad clear for us, and we should learn what is good and what should be avoided, and that is only taught by the common sense of the deen. So this is number one, we need to appreciate what is a sin. Number two, we need to appreciate the consequences of a sin. And the one key consequence is the distance that it creates between a person and Allah. One key consequence, the distance that it creates between a person and Allah. Another key consequence, the harm that it brings them in this world. Another key consequence, the harm that it brings them in the hereafter. So we need to appreciate those consequences. Now, part of this becomes experiential. I'll tell you that as a person develops in Tasawwuf and begins to gain an experience of their deen, when they sin, it'll hit them like an arrow in the heart. But wait, when you have something valuable and you lose it, it hits you like an arrow. If I tell you, oh, there was a guy who lost $10,000 yesterday in the stock market, you're like, who cares? But if it's you, I didn't sleep last night because it was my $10,000. I had something and I lost it. So if a person has a connection with Allah and experience of deen, and then they sin and the arrow hits their heart, they feel it. And maybe one of the best examples of this, if anyone in this room has done i'tikaf, and then they leave i'tikaf, and then they go out and something happens that was unintended, they feel like their heart bleeds. Literally, they feel like their heart bleeds. And you can ask anybody, or you can try it for yourself and experience this, because they had something that they spent 10 days developing, and it was so special and unique, and all of a sudden they get blindsided and they get shot with an arrow in the heart and they're bleeding. Now, you take a dead body, there's no blood in it. There's no blood in the dead body to begin with, so what's going to happen? They're not going to, you got a dead corpse, and you're moving it. The corpse doesn't feel a thing. So most of us are dead to begin with. How are we going to feel anything when we sin? But if a person were to achieve a little bit of deen, then certainly they would feel the consequences. So this is what I mean by appreciating sin and understanding its consequences. And this is why when Sahaba would happen to just deviate from that straight path and make a mistake, they would immediately make tawbah. They would immediately make tawbah. You find countless examples in the hadith and in the sunnah where the Prophet, where somebody approaches the Prophet ﷺ and says, I wronged myself, I wronged myself, I wronged myself, and then they explain what they did. And to us it sounds so minor, but they felt like it was so major because they appreciated that any deviation from the path of Allah and anything that could potentially displease Allah was something to be absolutely avoided. So we have to appreciate what sins are, which requires some knowledge and learning. We have to appreciate the consequences of those sins, which requires some understanding and also some experience. And then we need to understand and analyze what are the environments that lead to sin, and we need to avoid those. And honestly, these last two, well, I guess the Shaykh plays a role in all three. But particularly understanding how I got there. Now listen very carefully. Sin is a fire. But every fire begins with a spark. Listen again very carefully. Sin is a fire, but every fire begins with a spark. When we find ourselves engaged or trapped in some sin, generally we can go back and we can trace where is the spark. And if we can trace where the spark is, that's where the battle lies. So for example, if I find that I'm sinning in a certain environment, or at a certain place, or in a certain circumstance, or under certain stress, We need to identify those things, and then we need to pare back those things to create the environment that's going to allow for success. And by the way, this principle is a Quranic principle. This notion of avoiding the environment to avoid sin is a Quranic principle. Allah states, وَلَا تَقْرَبَا هَذِهِ الشَّجَرَةِ فَتَكُونَا مِنَ الظَّالِمِينَ. This is the command given to Adam and Hawa alayhi salam when they were in Jannah, that you can eat and enjoy any of this Jannah, but not this tree. This tree cannot be approached. Now look, the actual problem was the tree, correct? But to avoid the problem, they're told, don't even go near the tree. وَلَا تَقْرَبَا هَذِهِ الشَّجَرَةِ. Don't even approach this tree. Because if someone approaches something, it's easy to slip. It becomes a slippery slope. So generally speaking, it's very important for us as a principle when we're trying to avoid sin, to avoid the environment of sin. Number one. Number two, if sin does occur, it should always be followed immediately by istighfar and a good deed. If sin does occur, it should be followed by istighfar and a good deed. So what that means is that we are under surveillance. We are constantly surveilling. And the moment we see a breach of our perimeter, we immediately close it by making istighfar and asking for forgiveness from Allah. And ideally, we want to follow it up with a good deed. Because every good deed opens the door to the next good deed. And every sin opens the door to the next sin. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to close that door, and I'm going to open the door to good so that I can do the next good. So this is a very important principle as well. The Prophet ﷺ said, when a servant commits a sin, a black mark appears upon their heart. If they abandon the sin and seek forgiveness and repent, then their heart will be polished. If they return to the sin, the blackness will be increased until it overcomes their heart. Everyone has heard this. Everyone knows this principle. So we are very particular. The moment there's a mark, we take it away. And we follow it up with a good deed so that we don't return to that sin. Now, this is a general principle in life, by the way. When is the time that you most appreciate that your car is dirty? When is the time that you most appreciate your car is dirty? When it's totally covered in dirt? No. When you wash it. Because when you wash it, if a little speck of dirt comes on it, you feel it. That's when you feel it the most. You know, somebody who has a brand new car, they park it way in the corner of the parking lot. Why do they park it way in the corner of the parking lot? So, okay, somebody's coming to the masjid, they have their old car, they constantly drive it. It's even a nice car, it doesn't matter. They drive it, they park anywhere. The day they buy a new car, they park in the corner of the parking lot far away from everybody else. Why? Because they appreciate how pristine that car is, and they don't even want a scratch to come on it. They don't want anyone to open the door and even ding the car. And as soon as they get out of the masjid, they'll still walk around the car and double check that it's as clean as it was and as pristine as when they first parked, even though nobody's parked next to them. Because when somebody keeps something new, they appreciate the tiniest defect on it. When somebody keeps something new and clean, they appreciate the tiniest defect on it. So we are people who don't let sin pile up on our heart. Otherwise, sin upon sin, sin upon sin, sin upon sin, it just becomes routine. We keep our heart pristine. By keeping our heart pristine, every single new dot, black dot, will be appreciated and immediately removed. So this becomes a major emphasis of tasawwuf. It's called istighfar, seeking forgiveness, tawbah, repenting to Allah. This is a continuous theme of tasawwuf. Additionally, whenever a sin becomes apparent, it should be immediately addressed. Now, what I mean by this, so we've talked about the fact that when a person does a sin, they should immediately make tawbah and follow it up with a good deed, or immediately make istighfar and follow up with a good deed. By the way, how can they make istighfar? It's simply feeling regret in their heart and saying, Ya Allah, I seek your forgiveness. Or saying, Astaghfirullah. That's sufficient to wipe the sin away, and then again you follow it up with a good deed. Now, what I'm trying to get at here is that if a sin becomes generally apparent, it should be addressed immediately. Now, what do I mean by this? This means that in life, there are many things that we do that we don't immediately appreciate are wrong until we see later through the light of whatever the circumstance might be. For example, I might be involved in a business transaction. It's not good for me, it's not good for my deen, but I can't see it. Until one day, I wake up and I say, wait a minute, I shouldn't be doing that. So when a sin becomes apparent, this is what I mean by when a sin becomes apparent. When a sin becomes apparent, it must be immediately addressed. Because that's a gift from Allah. That light, that understanding, that opening, that's an opening. It's a gift from Allah. And the way that we reciprocate that is to subsequently make an immediate change in our life and to rectify and act upon that gift. And what will happen then is the next gift will come. So if my eyes open up, for example, I have a false notion that my relative is wrong and I'm right. Okay, let's just say I have this notion in my head. I have a fight with my relative is wrong and I'm right. And one day something happens and I start thinking, well, wait a minute. When I look at it from the perspective of my relative, maybe that's what they're thinking. Maybe they do see it another way. Maybe they are right. The moment that awareness comes to me, I have to pick up the phone and call my relative and say, I was thinking about this yesterday and I just realized that I was the one that was wrong. Because if I don't act on that, I'm not going to get the next gift. So generally speaking, we must act whenever a sin becomes apparent, and we need to act on it immediately and make the appropriate changes, clean up the appropriate mess in order to ensure that Allah opens the next door to the next opening, to the next awareness. The premise here is this ayah, وَزَيَّنَ لَهُمُ الشَّيْطَانِ أَعْمَالَهُمْ. And shaitan made their conduct appear good to them. So here's what we're trying to say, that sometimes our conduct, even if it's bad, apparently looks good. Because shaitan makes somebody's conduct look good even when it's bad. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants the opening of understanding that this is what I did is wrong or what I'm doing is wrong, we need to immediately act on it, make the appropriate changes, clean up the mess from the back, and that will be a blessing upon us. It'll save us from a difficulty down the line in the hereafter, and it'll be a means to open up the next opening of understanding that Allah might bestow upon us. So it basically is like taking a step, which then allows another 10 steps to come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This one step, what I mean by this one step, this one topic, avoiding sin, is the key component to spiritual development. How many times have I said this? How many times will we say it again? This one step, avoiding sin, is the fundamental component to spiritual development. Because the rest of Islam is so good and so complete and so inherently beneficial that it will fill the heart with tremendous good and tremendous experience if a person can avoid sin. By plugging the hole of sin, the heart naturally fills with the goodness of Islam. By plugging the heart of sin, the heart naturally fills with the goodness of Islam. In essence, we are spiritual beings plagued by a human experience. Now understand this. We are spiritual beings. What's holding back our spirituality is that we're humans doing things that we shouldn't do. The animalistic desires within us overcome us. So we don't need to worry about making ourselves more spiritual. Yes, we can grow the spirit. I'm not arguing that. But we need to focus on reducing these human tendencies of the nafs and of sin and of disobedience. And by doing that, the spirit will naturally take over. Right? Because you could say this the other way. You could say we are human beings looking for a spiritual experience. But I would argue it's the other way. Listen, it's a little subtle. You could say this statement two ways. You could say we are spiritual beings plagued by a human experience. It means that we're inherently spiritual, but we're undergoing this human experience of having a nafs and being in dunya, which is the truth, right? Because this body is limited, but we're actually a spirit. That's who we really are. But if you reverse the statement, it's not the case. We're not, you could say it, but it wouldn't be as effective. We're human beings trying to find a spiritual experience. That's not who we are. We're not. The body is not the key component. The soul is the key component. So again, this is a very key central premise. A little subtle, but hopefully I made it clear.